Coming up on ParaTruth Reborn, we'll be talking to Jonathan Kendall about his book, The Metaphysics of UFOs.
Welcome to ParaTruth.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to ParaTruth Reborn. My name is Eric.
And I'm Justin.
And tonight we are talking with Dr. Jonathan Kendall about UFOs, consciousness, parallel realities, and the possibility that the phenomenon may be connected to the spiritual realm. Dr. Kendall, welcome to ParaTruth Reborn.
Thank you guys for having me. It's an honor to be here, and please just call me Jonathan or JK.
You got it, JK. I like it. Now, before we really get into the UFO phenomenon, what first sparked your interest in the paranormal activity and metaphysics?
Well, I've always been interested in paranormal activity growing up. You know, my grandmother claimed to live in a haunted house, which I believe she did. She would tell us some really interesting stories. Some people in my family have had UFO experiences. My grandfather was on his way home from work one day with three of his coworkers, and they were driving on this mountain road, and into the valley below, they saw this orange sphere hovering there. And it was silent, wasn't moving. They got out and looked at it, decided to get back in the car, drive down the hill where they could get a little bit of a closer look. And their view was obscured as they were driving down the hill. And by the time they got to this new place in the road where they could see into that same valley, it had disappeared. So stories like that had always enamored me. I started working about 2020 on a book on apparitions, and I was reading some material by Hilary Evans, who studied the paranormal aspects of reality. And he was talking about this interesting feature called Men in Black, which I come to find out were associated with UFO lore, and which in some cases seem to be apparitional. And somehow, as if by some force, I got completely on a tangent before that book was even done. And I started writing about UFOs. And a couple of years later, I kind of wondered what had happened. But that's essentially how we got here. But I've always had a passing interest in the subject, or more than a passing interest in the subject, leading up to me kind of diving headfirst into this study.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, just to clarify, what he's talking about is not the Men in Black that you see in the movies, because these Men in Black are way creepier than Will Smith in the movies.
By far, yes.
Yeah. So you're a board certified physician in internal medicine and nephrology. How has that training really influenced how you approach these different experiences and activity?
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, thank you for asking that. I try to take a scientific approach to it. So whenever you're seeing a patient, you want to gather data. You take it from the history of what the patient tells you that led them into, say, the hospital or to your clinic. You get lab tests. You might get imaging studies. You'll have physical exam findings, and you want to put it together into a pattern, and you develop a differential diagnosis, such as 5 or 6 things you think it might be. You try to do further tests to try to refine it. Then you eventually get your diagnosis. And after you've got enough experience, some things jump out at you pretty quickly in terms of what it is you're dealing with. But that same kind of approach I take to UFO cases. Now, it's different because you don't have the physical evidence or imaging evidence as much, to an extent. A lot of it boils down to testimony, and you have to decide, is this person who claimed to see a UFO, is this testimony internally coherent? Is it consistent? Is there any corroborating witnesses, ideally that reported this thing independently? And in some cases, you do have you do have sensor data like radar data and things like that. And I just look to see, are there more reasons to believe this than not? And some cases are overwhelmingly positive in that regard. And some you say there's probably a prosaic explanation to this.
Right.
Well, now you've been at least a semi-believer in this phenomenon for quite a while, but did your scientific and medical background initially make you more skeptical of the paranormal claims or just more intrigued by them?
I had learned to kind of set them aside at some point because obviously our academic world is steeped, for better or worse, in scientific materialism, which is pretty much what you see around us. The matter in front of us and so forth is all that exists. Somehow that never deterred me into disbelieving this because I I guess I never bought into scientific materialism in full for various reasons. So it helps to have an open mind. If you don't, when you study this, it doesn't matter how much evidence there is, you're never going to be convinced.
Right.
But I think real science isn't assuming the conclusion before you study it. It's actually looking at the data and coming to the best conclusion.
Okay. What made you want to write this book, the Metaphysics of UFOs?
Well, I got all this data whenever I got into the subject, and I really thought, and I still waver on this to some degree, I thought that it dovetails into a book I'd written earlier on apparitional phenomenon, spiritual phenomenon. It seems to really resonate with that world, and that's what got me interested in it. And I wanted to eventually write a comprehensive book on all of these different phenomena, the lore, the history of it. I talk about that a little bit in the introduction. I got in pretty early in this research into the Mothman of Point Pleasant, and I noticed that there seems to be a connection with cryptids and these UAP phenomenon and other kinds of paranormal activity. They tend to keep each other's company, and so it just really seemed to resonate to a large degree with what I was working on before. So I thought, well, why not a second book?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. And one thing that's really interesting is like a lot of these cryptid sightings that we see, you mentioned Mothman. Also, we think of like Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Oftentimes when people see these entities, they do explain some sort of light anomalies in the sky that seem to appear around the same time. At least that's what we've noticed in our research and with the various people we've discussed. Is that something that you've kind of encountered over the years as well as you've researched this topic?
Yeah, well, Stan Gordon's book, Silent Invasion, is great in that regard because he develops or basically presents an immense amount of data in Pennsylvania. I believe it was back in the 1970s, if I got the right date, where there's just an enormous amount of Sasquatch sightings and an enormous amount of UFO sightings that seem to go together. And they culminate in this case at the end that where witnesses have missing time, men in black encounters, UFO encounters, really creepy cryptid encounters. Yeah, so I think, and then getting back to Point Pleasant, I grew up about 40 miles away from Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where the Mothman, where all that took place. And that's one reason I think I was drawn to that story more than others. So I got John Keel's books, especially the Mothman Prophecies, some other works on the Mothman, studied it. And I had grown up learning about it, about this cryptid. I never knew that it was associated with all the UFOs, poltergeist, men in black activity,
Right.
though, until I studied it. That was a real eye opener for me.
Yeah, my mom grew up in Wheeling, West Virginia, so that's kind of what made me think of really wanting to pursue the story of the Mothman, just because it was from where my mom was from, and then wasn't far from us in Ohio either. So, now, do you believe UFOs are physical objects, spiritual manifestations, interdimensional phenomenon, something altogether different, or a combination?
I think yes is the short answer. I do think that they are extra dimensional. I want to qualify that in saying that there were times over the last 4 years, if you had asked me on the right day, I would have probably said extraterrestrial, meaning at least that they come from somewhere within our home galaxy or home universe.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think there's some good arguments to that effect.
Mhm.
But while they are in our universe, if I'm right that they're extra dimensional or if they're extraterrestrial, they're undeniably physical. Because they register on radar. There's been so many good cases of landing sites where they'll land, leave depressions in the earth once they take off.
Mhm.
Scientists have studied the ground inside these depressions where a flying saucer has landed and outside, and have noticed the differences. So you got that physical data. Whenever they're in the vicinity of cars, sometimes they will shut the cars down totally. So they'll leave lasting impacts on the environment. Most chillingly, they seem to, if you get close enough to one, they probably mostly inadvertently will cause physical harm to recipients. Jacques Vallée, in one of his books, he says that there are over 900 documented cases of people being harmed while in the vicinity of a UFO, and usually that takes the shape of some kind of radiation damage, radiation sickness.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Now, why do you believe that traditional extraterrestrial or the traditional extraterrestrial hypothesis doesn't fully explain the UFO phenomenon itself?
I think it doesn't really make sense of a lot of the data that we see. We've already kind of hinted at some of it. Why do they appear around cryptids or appear around cryptids? Although, of course, as we know, some of the cryptid specialists, they're very passionate about their own flesh and blood,
Of course.
flesh and blood interpretation, which I respect, and I think a good case could be made from that. But then you get into some of these other, maybe less controversial aspects, like poltergeist phenomenon
Mhm.
and abductions. When you get into the abduction material, that strikes me as more of a spiritual experience. I don't think aliens that have the technology to travel astronomical distances, I feel like they'd be able to get information about us in much more subtle ways than having to kidnap us, take us on board their ship, and perform these horrifying exams on us.
Right.
So I do think whatever this phenomenon is, it wants us to believe that's what it's doing, that it is extraterrestrial. But I think that's all theater. I think it's more spiritual in nature.
Okay. Well, so on that note then, what are your thoughts on the different theories that, the government and these extraterrestrials or these beings are in cahoots with each other, and that there has been kind of a hybrid program going for years? Wouldn't that kind of denote that maybe if there are abductions, maybe they're abducting their hybrid children just to make sure they're adapting okay?
Yeah, so the hybridization phenomenon, certainly that would seem to suggest more of an extraterrestrial or overtly physical phenomenon if there is a hybridization program.
Right.
I'd answer that in a couple of different ways. First of all, I would say that this hybridization theme is not anything new, even to the spiritual realm. When you go back to like the Celtic lands, the fairies,
Mhm.
there are cases where there are ostensible hybridization going on or sexual encounters amongst these different beings, and they tend to reside in other dimensions, at least as I understand the Celtic lore.
Right. The
Same thing,
changelings of the fairy.
yeah. Same thing with Middle Eastern jinn. And then if you go back to Genesis 6 of the Bible,
Yeah.
the ancient interpretation, which I believe is the correct one, whether you believe this is real or not, or just simply mythology, you have the sons of God of the divine council who basically consorted with human females and produced hybrid children. So I would argue, even on a spiritual basis, hybridization is not impossible. But I'm going to be a little controversial here, and I'm going to say, though, I've not seen enough evidence that hybridization is actually occurring, whether it's a spiritual or an extraterrestrial phenomenon. I know that flies in the face of researchers like Dave Jacobs, what he's found in his books, and Bud Hopkins. But I'm not convinced that's happening in any literal physical way.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine.
There was this brings me back to more of a Christian aspect of this, in a sense. There's a book published back in 2010 called Unholy Communion by an author named David Rufino. Justin had actually interviewed him. I was in LA at the time and couldn't make it. But he basically performed some experiments where he would meet with these people who were constantly being claimed to be abducted or oppressed by aliens, by extraterrestrials. And he found that in his time with them over the course of months, that using the name of Jesus would often push these alien entities away, and these people would no longer be abducted. And he found that there's some sort of power in using prayer and spiritual warfare in combating these entities, which kind of takes, kind of brings us into this whole spiritual aspect. I think it's the first time I even heard of aliens or extraterrestrial life possibly being extraterrestrial, or I'm sorry, being spiritual in the first place. And I just thought it was really interesting because his whole book is just full of documentation and examples of his findings. And it's really, really compelling. A lot of these people, when you think of like alien abductions and the stories we hear, people are waking up at 3 a.m. They're missing time. They're seeing shadow people. There's all these other things happening in the process. And these are same things that are very, very similar when it comes to, say, demonic oppression or spiritual oppression. The 3 a.m. mark, waking up and seeing shadow people, having a feeling of dread, having little control of your body, sleep paralysis, things like that. So that was very intriguing. And it just kind of helps marry this idea between the extraterrestrials and a spiritual entity. And takes me back to the Nephilim and Genesis 6.
Yeah, I watched an interview. It's been a few months ago between Ross Coulthart and Jacques Vallée. And Coulthart told Vallée in the interview, neither of them are Christians, but he said, maybe the Christians are right. I've talked to a number of them who, when they've encountered these things, they've used Jesus' name to expel them, and without exception, it's always worked. But kind of looking at that more broadly, Ann Druffel wrote a book called How to Defend Yourself Against Alien Abduction. I think I got that title right, or at least it's close. And she talks about 9 different methods that people have used want to be able to ward off an abduction experience. And one of them is appealing to religious icons such as Jesus, the Blessed Virgin Mary. And she details a few others as well. But yeah, it seems like that intention using that spiritual power does matter. And again, that I think that bolsters the argument that this is some kind of spiritual phenomenon.
Well, going off of that, then, is it possible in your, maybe you found it in your own research, or maybe just off of your own opinion, that this phenomena adapts its appearance according to the cultures, the belief systems, or even expectations of the witness itself, themselves?
Oh, I think so. I think definitely. Just look at our recent history. Now, I know a lot of people think that the 1897 airships were hoaxes,
Mhm.
and there were a lot of hoaxes associated with that. But Jerome Clark, he has just an absolutely fantastic article in his massive UFO encyclopedia on this. There apparently were evidential sightings of that 1897 airship, but it looked like something, from a Jules Verne novel, which was popular back then. So this thing was appearing a number of years before the Wright brothers took off from Kitty Hawk in the plane. And it would just be this kind of long, what you'd imagine an airship. It would have appendages, a big light on the front, and people would see it flying over these. It started out in California. It got into some of the Midwestern towns eventually. And then they just see it taken off, just gone in a flash, kind of like modern UFO reports. And then there are Foo Fighters in 1942, World War II, these orbs that are just flying alongside Allied craft and German aircraft. Nobody knew what they were. I think there were over 100 documented sightings. 1946 in Holland, Sweden, they were the ghost rockets. And a lot of people thought, well, that's the Russians messing around with rocket technology. but that didn't quite seem to jive. It seemed to be something very ephemeral.
So
And then, of course, you got Kenneth Arnold and the flying saucer. So it does seem to track our culture. And then I think when you get back into the things like fairies and jinn, some of the stuff I mentioned earlier, that kind of goes along with it as well.
Oh, we actually saw something kind of like that just a few years ago. The orbs that were showing up and these fighter planes trying to take them down. They were trying to use drones to take them down. So I think that phenomena is still very much alive today too.
Sure.
From a medical perspective, and I'm very interested to hear your answer on this because it's a question that I've never asked anybody. Are there any conditions that have to be considered before concluding that someone has experienced something paranormal or supernatural in nature?
Sure. You'd want to know all forms of psychopathy, I think, so, especially those that cause hallucinations, because that certainly can lead to this effect. There was a book called The Abduction Phenomena, or the Abduction Enigma, written in, I believe, it's the late 1990s by Kevin Randall, and then a couple other authors, Cohn and Estes. It was probably the best skeptical book on the abduction phenomenon I'm aware of. And they mentioned, for instance, there was a lady that was started on a medicine called fluoxetine, which is an antidepressant, and then suddenly her abduction phenomena stopped. So that's one thing. Then there's the fantasy prone personality. Now that's a little tricky. 4% of people in the population have this thing where they really have a difficult time knowing fact from fantasy. So they could be driving down the road, they could see an apparition of a child running out in front of the car and not know whether or not they're creating it or not. They might slam on the brakes. So they have to be really careful, but they have that kind of that boundary deficit disorder. So that, I think, can explain some of them. Sleep paralysis. I know, Eric, you'd mentioned that earlier. I do think that's a medical phenomenon where you're literally half asleep, half awake. In those situations, you'll wake up, your skeletal muscles will still be paralyzed because your brain is emitting these inhibitory neurotransmitters. So when we dream, when we're asleep, the reason we don't, if we're running in the street during a dream, the reason we don't act that out and fall out of bed all the time is because our skeletal muscle tone is relaxed by these inhibitory neurotransmitters. When sleep paralysis, you wake up, but this inhibition is still going on, so you can't move. But then you're also in a state of REM sleep, so you're literally seeing your own surrounding environment, and you're imprinting dream imagery upon it. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's where people will see these dark, shadowy figures approaching, the so-called demon sitting on the chest, not being able to breathe. That kind of thing happens. Now, I will say I don't think all forms of sleep paralysis are merely subjective hallucination, though. Mm-hmm. There was a case that Ann Druffel in a different book talks about in the Tayunga Canyon context, where two people have this happen to them at the same time, and they experience very similar imagery. And two people aren't going to experience the same hallucination. It's very unlikely they'd go into sleep paralysis at the same time. So that does seem to be a gateway, I think, in some cases, probably not most, into having an objectively real phenomenon. So those are a couple of the examples I would use to medical aspects.
Okay.
Yeah. So then how do you actually, I guess, how do you potentially discern what is one of these hallucinations or neurological illnesses versus an actual encounter that someone may have exhibited?
Yeah. So I think if it's a person, say they're sleeping in bed and then they say they wake up, they're paralyzed, they have this creature coming towards them, then the sleep paralysis breaks. Then they seek out an abduction investigator, someone that specializes this, and you have, probably through confabulation, that is the non-deliberate making up of a narrative based on expectation. Now, the person's not doing this on purpose. it's very non-deliberate, but they remember it as if it's real after the hypnotism session. So that person I would be very skeptical of had an alien abduction phenomenon. I would probably tend to discount that. There's no way you could do that for sure, because there's, in theory, no reason to think that aliens can't come into your house if they have this kind of sophisticated technology. But really, what I like to see are multi-witness cases, 2 or more people that were definitely in the awake state. A lot of the early cases, like Betty and Barney Hill, the Casey County, Kentucky abduction case, where there's multiple people. Because there's multiple people, that essentially rules out hallucination. And then people that have after effects, whether they're physical, traumatic after effects, which is very common. And then there's often a litany of paranormal after effects as well. Those kinds of cases, I tend to think, have some kind of objective reality to them.
Okay.
Now, you mentioned earlier about cases where UFO witnesses or encounters have had situations where people have had like radiation sickness or poisoning or something like that. Have there been any other reported injuries or symptoms from witnesses that can't be explained by ordinary medical causes?
That cannot be explained?
Yeah.
I guess it depends on the context. Like if you take the Cash Landrum case in Houston, 1980, where the 2 ladies get out of the car and they see this kind of triangular shaped object. They were Christians, so they thought it was a religious vision, but it was just on fire, heat. Betty Cash, she got out of the car and it just felt like she was being burned, kind of having physical burns on her skin.
Mm.
And had to present to the hospital. I think she had 2 different hospitalizations that was almost a month long combined, and just got really sick, ended up indirectly dying of complications of what was apparent radiation poisoning. I mean, I would say in that case, the context makes it clear that even though it was consistent with radiation damage, it was caused by whatever this UAP was that she saw, if that's what you mean. I think, yeah, I don't know of any cases offhand that can't be medically explained, but it's the context that makes it, that seems to clearly attach it to a UFO encounter in some cases.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break here to hear from tonight's sponsor. A quick thank you to our supporting sponsor, Nodakian Studios. Looking for something truly one of a kind? Nodakian Studios creates high-fired ceramics that are dishwasher, microwave, and food safe. Every mug, bowl, vase, bottle, and planter is wheel-thrown and hand-decorated, making each piece unique. They also offer pottery classes for all skill levels. Whether you're touching clay for the first time or looking to expand your artistic skills, Nodakian Studios, where craftsmanship and creativity come together. Find out more at nodakianstudios.com. Welcome back, everybody. Now, Jonathan, one thing that has been very prominent over the last couple of years, at least, if not longer, but we see it a lot on TikTok, is this idea of parallel realities or parallel universes. What kind of evidence suggests that UFOs could potentially originate from parallel realities rather than distant planets?
I think some cases, especially over at Skinwalker Ranch, northeastern Utah, you have some situations where people saw portals open up. Terry Sherman, going back into probably the 1990s, he reports having seen cases where a portal will open up and it's at night where he's at in his environment, and it'll be daylight on the other side of this portal. And they'll see he reported UFOs actually coming through this portal. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's a parallel reality. It could be on the other side of the earth for all we know, or somewhere across the galaxy. But I think that would be one example of it. Other than that, I can't think of any physical aspect that I would say argues for a parallel reality, but getting back to the paranormal effects that seem to converge on a lot of UFO witnesses that we had talked about earlier. To me, and then in the context of alien abductions, so people will sometimes see deceased loved ones. Now, some of your nuts and bolts theorists will argue that that's a screen memory, that's a trick of the alien on your mind. Okay, maybe. But I think the most straightforward explanation is that these things seem to reside from a parallel reality that seems to be where kind of a spiritual denizen.
Okay.
Now, there's been so many theories out there about how these things may disappear, change shape, or move in impossible ways. How does theoretical physics help us understand that?
So that was one argument I thought at the outset, and maybe it still is, but I thought the apparent defying of physics, of these things, instantaneous acceleration, the observables, right? The 5, 6 observables, Lou Elizondo's work, that would seem to just these things move at such speed that and acceleration sometimes that the G forces would rip apart any kind of craft that we have right now.
Right.
And the human being inside it, right? Or the occupant inside it. I think, though, some astrophysicists have speculated on the fact that there might be some kind of so-called warp bubble that these crafts reside in. There's been even some apparent video photography, sensor evidence that they kind of see some kind of outline of this. It would explain why these ships are able to fly at supersonic speeds without setting off a sonic boom. Essentially, it would just be a warped area of space-time that they can literally change the space-time metric around the craft. And who knows what a technology or beings that are that sophisticated technologically that maybe have 1,000 years or even 1,000,000 years on us. Who's to say that they might not be able to accomplish that? But astrophysicists like Eric Davis, Hal Puthoff, Jim Lukatsky, to name a few, have written a lot of papers on trying to reconcile these observables, what seems to be defying physics, in ways that are actually consistent with general relativity. So, yeah, now a lot of that is speculative, admittedly, but what really gives it the ring of truth is that some of the maneuvers we're seeing today seem to mirror reports that you have back in the 1940s and 50s, back in the Project Sign and Blue Book era. So the fact that it seems to be the same kinds of maneuvers suggests that it might be real physics we're dealing with here. We wouldn't have the technology to mimic that today,
Right.
but it does have the ring of truth to it.
Yeah. It's definitely an interesting take, especially with how fascinated humans tend to be with this idea of manipulating time and space, especially when we're talking about space travel and trying to hit light speed, for example, in order to make it across the universe or the known galaxy, at least.
Yeah.
But so moving to like this idea of quantum mechanics, can quantum mechanics genuinely offer useful ideas for understanding these types of encounters, or is it sometimes just something that's misused in paranormal discussions?
It may be overused, perhaps, but quantum mechanics, the implications of it. I want to say this carefully. It doesn't prove a mystical view of the universe exists, but I think it provides a better framework for it than classic Newtonian mechanics does. I think it kind of really opens the imagination, but I would like to see more speculation on quantum mechanics within the scientific community. So I think the series of books by Jim Lukatsky, and his first couple books were co-authored by George Knapp and Colin Kelleher, and the last two were written by him. It starts with Skinwalkers at the Pentagon and ends with Future Visions. They talk a lot about relativity, warp space-time metric, a lot of different scientific concepts, it's very technical in places, immensely helpful. I don't know that they talk as much about quantum mechanics as I would like. What's interesting is this warp bubble, or this so-called shield, if you will. If you could build a shield around you or around a craft that is so strong that it seals you off from the surrounding environment. And when I say that, I mean sealing you off from thermal radiation, sealing you off from air molecules, and sealing you off from photons. Well, if you're sealed off from photons, that means you're invisible. Okay. It also means that you'd be put, if you could literally do that, you'd be the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment. It would come to life. In that craft, you would become essentially a superposition of multiple states. So that would be one thing. Can you really do it? I think these craft are doing it. It would be another scientific concept to say, or breakthrough, can you control your quantum wave function, your probability waves? If that's the case, it may make sense of why a craft can appear in one place, seemingly go invisible, and then appear, say, 2 miles to the northeast of where it was instantaneously.
Right.
I hope that is halfway cogent.
Yeah.
Here. Okay.
No, for sure. Can you and would you say like some of these experiences that people are seeing, like let's talk about like the orbs that people are seeing in the sky. You see multiple of them. People often say, "Oh, there are multiple UFOs. These are 3 different crafts." But with the way you're explaining it, it's almost like these 3 light anomalies that people might see. These might be light orbs. Might all be the same exact craft appearing in this 3 different places based on the amount of speed that they're using through quantum mechanics.
You mean if you're seeing 3 different lights at the same time?
Right.
Yeah, I suppose so, if it's moving fast enough. I think if they're stationary, I would probably go for another explanation, but who knows?
Right.
Maybe those 3 orbs are attached to some other kind of device, some other shape that's existing in a 4th spatial dimension that we're not able to currently access because we live in a 3D world.
Right.
If that makes and the orbs are what's creeping through, but in that 4th dimension, they're actually attached somehow. That will be speculative, but
Right.
that would seem to fit in theory with string theory.
Right. So kind of like for example, of the Phoenix lights, where they were all stationary. I think there were 6 or 8 lights, and this is what fascinates me about that case, was that a bird was witnessed flying into the area that these lights were in pure daylight, hit the area it was, and then fell to the ground. So in that regard, as far as like this particular case, and there have been other cases like this, where you see the lights at night, but during the day it's almost invisible. Would that denote a physical craft, and that they have some type of like light bending or hologram type technology that would kind of make them appear invisible?
Potentially. And I think when you talk about the Phoenix lights, people would look up against the starry backdrop, and as these lights were passing through, when they'd look up, they wouldn't see the stars, right? It would suggest a solid craft.
Right.
Yeah. But I think there's several different speculative ways of looking at that. They could be hiding themselves inside some kind of quantum envelope, where if you can block out photons or control that, you can become invisible in essence. I wonder too, we only see 4% of the electromagnetic spectrum. Only 4% is the visible part of that spectrum. So is it possible, are these UAPs hiding within this other 96%? Again, you go back to Skinwalker Ranch, there's a case where 3 security officers saw a portal open and a Sasquatch-like figure got out and walked off into the night. They went and investigated, and it disappeared. Most interesting thing about that is that they were wearing infrared vision goggles to see it. So this was all, and then if they took the goggles off, they couldn't see anything. It was totally invisible. So that would suggest that maybe these craft or maybe even creatures associated with them or not are hiding in this invisible part of the field. And then the other explanation would be some kind of metamaterials, which is able to just reflect the light and seem totally in stealth to any observers.
Right.
Sure. I think that's one thing that, I mean, of all cryptid sightings that we're aware of, but prominently when it comes to Bigfoot, uh, you know, we have so many videos, so many photos of alleged Bigfoot sightings, and yet all of them are more or less blurry, right? They're all kind of distorted as something, or if they're in the video, they're there for a moment, and then all of a sudden they vanish. And so people started getting this idea that maybe they are extraterrestrial beings, or maybe they are spiritual rather than physical creatures living in our forests somewhere around the world. And of course, there's a lot of evidence or arguments as to why they might exist in our forest, and we just haven't found them yet. There was just recently a monkey that was found, I believe in Australia, that they discovered just like last week, that no one had ever recorded before. And now they're saying, oh, well, that could exist. Bigfoot could exist too. But I do find it very interesting that because of these photos and videos that seem so blurry, they might have some sort of technology that actually purposely messes with the waves of the space around us and the light around us and makes our images blurry.
Yeah, same thing. Like you said with cryptids, the same thing with UFOs. You take a snapshot, the photons go towards the UFO, and it's going to get reflected in a kind of a messy way if that space-time metric is warped around it, right? So when it returns, it's not going to give you a clear image or a pristine image.
Right.
So, yeah, certainly. And yeah, I think I don't know the cryptid literature nearly as well to do the UFO literature. I know it well enough to be halfway well informed, I would say. And I know that I know that there's some good arguments for the flesh and blood aspect of that hypothesis. And again, I wonder, something we had talked about before the show started. I do wonder, parsimony notwithstanding, if there could be a real flesh and blood aspect. In other words, that they do live on our Earth somewhere and they just haven't been officially discovered. And yet this phenomenon is also mimicking them.
Okay.
It could be two different things going on.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on UFO encounters? What would that suggest about the nature of human consciousness?
UFO encounters and human consciousness.
Like what, as in, are we kind of making some of this stuff up as we go along? Like, is our consciousness trying to place things there that maybe aren't necessarily there, or trying to put an explanation on them?
Yeah. It's interesting you should ask that, because I've been working out something in my mind. I haven't quite got it there, but it reflects some of the research I've done. I think there's three different forms of paranormal activity, in essence. I think there's the paranormal activity that we create with our conscious minds. And some people that are open to parapsychology, but don't necessarily believe in gods or demons or anything else, or UFOs. They believe that we're essentially worshiping our own unconscious ideas. That's kind of a depressing view. It's not one I take.
Right.
Then but I believe there's another category where you really have physical, say UFOs or apparitions or other figures that actually come into your space time. They're just there, and no matter how many people are there, if there's 500 people that happen to be present when it's there, they're all going to see it roughly the same. I would imagine the Tic Tac UAP would be something along those lines. And then there's this middle ground where I think sometimes the phenomenon manifests and it seems to mirror our consciousness. And maybe that's why in 1897 people saw airships, and now they're seeing flying saucers or triangles or Tic Tacs. Yeah, it just kind of mirrors our culture. And maybe, maybe if the young visionaries, and not getting like into a religious example, the young visionaries in Fatima of Portugal, maybe if they hadn't been Catholic, maybe who they saw wouldn't have identified herself as the Virgin Mary. Maybe if it had been an indigenous tribe, it would have been one of the gods of the indigenous tribe that appeared. I'm certainly open to that possibility. That's something I'm trying to flesh out. But I'll also say, in regards to consciousness, close encounters of the fifth kind, people seem to be able, in some cases, to summon UFOs. Yeah. I would not recommend that. I mentioned Kathleen Martin a lot. She, in her book Extraterrestrial Contact, mentions a lot of very dark episodes. She mentions one in depth, but she said that she knows a number of people that have summoned UFOs and they've gotten these really malignant attachments to them and manifestations, and it was really hard to get rid of. One of the people that she discusses was a pilot in the southwestern part of the United States that ended up dying.
Whoa.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that takes us kind of back to this whole idea of spiritual warfare too. Is like, be careful of what doors are opening because you never know what's on the other side. And you know how many times, especially in our, I'll say industry, that is the paranormal and paranormal conversation. We encounter so many people who claim to have opened a door doing seances or calling upon a spirit, playing with the Ouija board. And then these attachments stick around and they cause trouble. And so you're saying that something very similar happens when people are trying to call upon these UFOs. And
Yes.
there tends to be, that's pretty wild. And it's interesting to see that connection still.
Yeah. And to be fair to the other side, Ray Hernandez has written a series of great books here recently, Beyond UFOs and a greater reality. Well, he talks about a case where he summoned UFOs multiple times, and it seems to not have been the negative experience that these others have. But I think, I just wonder when you open a door, I don't know if you can be sure what's going to walk through it. That's why I like to study this stuff at a distance. And one place I'm really fascinated by, and I mentioned earlier, Skinwalker Ranch.
Mhm.
There, a lot of the security officers, the NIDS days, the National Institute for Discovery of Science, billionaire Bob Bigelow, him and his team that went there, and then the OSAP Bass days, the government study program under Jim Lukatsky from 2008 through 2010. Pretty much everyone that went there during that latter period of time would take home hitchhikers.
Mm.
They would go, and then later on, even if they were still staying on the ranch, sometimes back at their homes, their wives, their significant others would experience these like orbs in the house, haunting phenomenon, poltergeists. I know in one case, there was one of those that went there. I think it's a very prominent ufologist. I don't know if he's gone public. I'm pretty sure I know who this is, but I can't say it publicly. His wife would look outside and see these dogmen like werewolves in their backyard. Yeah, so that's not a place I don't think I'd want a vacation there personally.
Yes.
There's some people with a lot. There's some people that's a lot braver than me, but I actually like studying the paranormal from a safer distance.
Yeah, totally understandable. And I've heard those stories of people who've summoned something or been on a paranormal grounds in which they saw some sort of dogman or werewolf-like creature circling the
Sure.
property. So that's really interesting. But one thing I do also want to bring up is this. Going back to the physical aspect of the UFOs, this is something that reaches back to ancient history. We're talking about pictographs in ancient Egypt. Even the Holy Bible, the book of Ezekiel, talks about God's chariot, and it comes off as very UFO-ish with the idea of metallic material and wheels and spinning propellers and things like that. So, despite the fact that a lot of this seems to be connected to the spiritual realm, we're still seeing very physical things appear as well, which I think kind of causes this imbalance a little bit, which kind of separates people on the subject.
100%. And that was something I kept struggling with. I would read all this physical evidence and say, okay, well, maybe it's extraterrestrial. Then I would read about all the high strangeness that we've talked about and say, okay, now it's definitely spiritual. And abductions, at least in my mind, make more sense as spiritual. So how do you solve the contradiction? And I eventually decided, hey, you can't. You cannot take the physical and the spiritual as if they are opposites. Yeah, you could be physical and spiritual at the same time. Now, I'll admit what pushes the boundary here, and it's probably the greatest challenge to my quote spiritual / extra dimensional interpretation is the idea of crash flying saucers that have been collected. I believe Roswell is probably authentic. Thanks to Paul Blake Smith, we know Cape Girardeau. That's a pretty interesting case of a possible crash retrieval. Then James Fox Virginia, Brazil. I mean, look at that case. I mean, that's a very solid case of an actual alien being taken into captivity. Well, I've never thought of a demon or an angel being able to be taken into captivity or dying because it couldn't breathe our air and so forth. So I came very reluctantly to the tentative conclusion, that the government probably has crashed flying saucers, crashed UFOs in its midst. But I don't think the evidence is compelling for that. But I do think the evidence puts me in a position to where I think it's probably the case that is true. And I think, getting back to Virginia, Brazil, that really suggests strong evidence that biologics have been taken by at least the Brazilian government, which in the U.S. government seemed to be involved in that case as well.
Yeah, right.
And I'll admit that's the biggest challenge to my hypothesis, but I had to end up concluding that it was the case because the evidence right now is making me lean that direction.
Right. Do you believe that humanity is prepared to understand the truth about this phenomenon?
Educated guess, yes. I'd have to know more about it. If I had to guess, the government knows more than we do. All the information that's gained in the skiffs, certainly those these unelected so-called deep state, if that really exists and they're trying to reverse engineer UFOs, they know more about it. I would guess that they haven't gotten as far with the reverse engineering as some claim they have. That's just my educated guess. There's a lot of people that would disagree with that. So, yeah, I think I doubt that it would be anything earth shattering. I think proponents of the major religions would find a way to integrate this, whether it's extraterrestrial or extra dimensional. But who knows? Maybe there is some secret out there that would put the lie to everything we think is reality, and but I can only speculate on whether or not that's the case.
Right.
But my best guess would be no. It's something we would integrate.
Yeah.
So, what do you hope your readers take away from the metaphysics of UFOs?
Most importantly, it's I think really I don't care as much about interpretation. I've got mine, but as I've mentioned here and elsewhere, all my conclusions are provisional. And I think the most important thing I want people to take away is, hey, this is real. It's a real phenomenon. I didn't know what I was going to find when I got sidetracked into this area of inquiry. The evidence isn't good. The evidence for UFOs is not great. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Yeah, it's as J. Allen Hynek said, it's an embarrassment of riches. And he said that decades ago. We got a lot more data now. There's no way all this data can be explained away prosaically. I think that would be my number one takeaway. Come at it with an open mind. And I would at least say to my fellow theists out there, if you believe, and say, let's take Christians, for instance. So you believe that there was a rabbi in 30 AD thereabouts, or 30 CE, that was raised from the dead, that exorcised demons, that performed miraculous healings, and so forth. You believe Moses parted the Red Sea. You should be open-minded to other kinds of anomalous phenomena. That doesn't mean it's real. You're not obligated to believe it, but at least be open-minded towards it.
Right.
You're going to find, if you look at the evidence in an open-minded way, it's overwhelming.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. All right. Last question that we always have for all of our guests. Where can everybody find you and find your work?
Yes, I'm on JonathanKendallMD.com. That's Kendall. And I'm on, I would go to Llewellyn.com. My book is available there, and it should be available through your local metaphysical bookstores.
Awesome. All right. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your research into the physical, spiritual, and metaphysical nature of UFOs. We really appreciate you being on.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been an honor and a privilege.
All right, ParaTruthers. So we asked the ParaTruthers community group, what do you believe UFOs are? Well, 22% of you said they are physical crafts from another planet. 11% said they are visitors from another dimension. Another 11% said that they are spiritual or consciousness-based phenomena. And of course, 1% said there's no such thing as UFOs or UAPs. There's always that 1%. Always that 1%.
I found it kind of fascinating that somebody even said, being in the paratruther community, 1% said it's not a thing at all.
Yeah. Well, as always, guys, tell us if this episode changed your mind, either in the comments or email us at paratruthradio@gmail.com, or even leave us a voice message on our website at paratruth.com. And if it didn't change your mind, tell us why. We'd love to know your opinions, thoughts, and any evidence that you're willing to share.
Absolutely.
Some truths are hidden in the dark, and we're here to bring them to light. So until next week, where you'll find us at the same time on the same channel, my name is Eric.
And I am Justin.
Peace.